Great. Okay. So welcome all of you. This is crunch time in terms of being active with our representatives and our Democratic senator. So I thank you for coming tonight, and we'll talk about something that probably a lot of people don't know very much about, and that's the idea that there's an awful lot of subsidies and tax breaks for the fossil fuel industry that have been going on for over a century. So that's why we've been talking about that, but I'd like to start with our sister giving us some inspirational words, and this is Sister Joyce Bell, and she's the Justice, Peace, and Integrity of Creation promoter for the Sisters and Servants of the Immaculate Heart of Mary from Immaculata, Pennsylvania. So happy to have Sister Joyce here, and I'm looking forward to your remarks. Thank you.
I thought I would start us off with a prayer, and having seen the change in the program, I tried to tailor it to what our topic is tonight.
Thank you.
If we could bow our heads for a moment as we pray. Creator God, Allah, Great Spirit, who infused energy and life into our wonderful Mother Earth. Hear the cries of your children today. Give us the clarity and courage to confront those who would carelessly extract your abundant gifts for a monetary profit. Give us the desire and will to fight for the poor and the excluded, whose livelihoods, health, and very existence are being threatened by the rapacious appetite of corporations seeking a bigger bottom line. Forgive us for the times we have taken the earth's resources for granted and wasted what you have given us. Transform our hearts and minds so that we would learn to care and share, to touch the earth with gentleness and with love, respecting all living things. Amen.
Amen. Thank you. Such a beautiful message, and it's so ecumenical and fits everybody. So our main speaker tonight is Rob Altenburg, and he is from PennFuture. He's the Senior Director of Energy and Climate for PennFuture, and PennFuture wrote a report about subsidies to the fossil fuel industries, and I have a feeling that Rob had a major part in this. Maybe he was the key author. So it's all yours, and thank you so much for agreeing to talk to us.
Oh, sure thing. Here, let me just share my slides here. So I think everybody should be able to see this.
Yep.
Go back here. Try to move this without moving up my. Just trying to move stuff around on my screen. And yeah, thank everyone for having me here. Again, my name is Rob Altenburg, Senior Director for Energy and Climate. And PennFuture, we're a statewide environmental nonprofit. We have offices in Harrisburg, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, Mount Pocono, and working on a physical office in Erie, although the pandemic seemed to get in the way of that. I like to start off a lot of the talks I do with this picture. Not only is it, I think it's a nice picture of the Capitol, but there's only one set of solar panels in this picture, and that's a little white roofed building down in the lower left-hand corner, and that's the PennFuture office. So it's like, this is our our little outpost, bringing clean energy to the state capitol. Because we're a statewide environmental nonprofit, most of the subsidies and issues I'm going to talk about and most of our report focuses on state subsidies as opposed to federal subsidies, although there's a lot of overlap and a lot of the messages are the same, whether the specific subsidy is state or federal. We just carved out one small piece of that pie. And we'll talk about subsidies, good and bad, why we have them, why in some cases we need them, why in some cases they've gone too far. But I think Jeff Goodall, I know he used to write for Rolling Stone and has done some other things. He has this great quote, and it's pretty true that most of our energy policy revolves around subsidies. It doesn't have to be that way, but that is what it has resulted in. So you really can't talk about clean energy or energy in general without looking at this piece of subsidization. Phyllis mentioned a report. This is our latest version of the report. It's the third edition that we've put these out periodically. The little QR code down there will take you to a link to the report. Otherwise, the easiest way to find it is to Google PennFuture subsidy report or PennFuture buried out of sight, and you'll get right to the report. It's a lot easier than putting our direct link on there. But what we do in this report periodically is we go over primarily state budget books, and we focus on identifying what are subsidies. And we talk about different types, whether it's foregone revenue, direct spending, not collecting for externalities like environmental damage and things like that. We also talk about the purposes of subsidies, and we make some recommendations on how to go forward. And we'll talk about a lot of those in the talk tonight. And in case you think that this is, that this idea of subsidies is clearly, it's like we in the environmental community don't like subsidies, and the fossil fuel community loves subsidies. It's not really quite that easy. This is a quote from one of the Koch brothers, who, at least in some cases, doesn't like subsidies. They certainly don't like subsidies that their businesses don't get. I think Charles Koch in particular has probably been a little bit more towards, arguing about against subsidies that even could benefit him. But typically what we see though in the industry is industries simply, whatever their industry gets, they just don't define as a subsidy. We saw that with the gas industry in Pennsylvania multiple times. Has gone to the legislature and got up and said it's the largest unsubsidized industry in the state, which is absolutely ridiculous, that the gas industry is unsubsidized. So just jumping right into what kind of things are out there. Well, actually, let me go back. Let me go back to the other slide. One of the things that's interesting, what Koch identifies in this slide, is there's a whole lot of different sorts of subsidies. Certainly, if the government directly cuts a check and sends it to somebody, that is clearly a subsidy. But what a lot of people don't treat as subsidies are things called tax expenditures. This is where the government either doesn't collect tax for something or gives somebody a tax credit if they do something. And that's one of the more frequent types of subsidies, especially when we come to fossil fuel subsidies. There's also essentially regulatory subsidies, where if a regulatory agency simply doesn't enforce rules or doesn't enforce rules strictly, or doesn't ensure that companies meet the highest standards, that can operate as a subsidy. Certainly, these loan guarantees, bailouts. We'll also talk about some examples where Pennsylvania actually does all of these. So we'll talk about them as we go along. In a report, we found well over $3 billion in subsidies from Pennsylvania alone each year. There's a lot of things we identified in the report that clearly are subsidies, but they're very difficult, if not impossible, to assign a number to them. And there's some we identified that will act as very large subsidies over a long period of time, but might not have a financial impact in 2019 or 2020. And in those cases, we didn't count that towards that greater 3 billion numbers. But I mean, just to give you an idea of the range and the examples of some of the things we do in Pennsylvania. Sales and use tax, Pennsylvania pays sales and use tax on pretty much everything. You think aside from food and, food, clothing, and those essentials. But Pennsylvania also largely exempts fuel purchases from sales and use tax. And a lot of people don't realize that in Pennsylvania, we don't have sales tax on our gasoline. We have a motor fuels tax, but there's a sales tax exemption. And when we flag this in the report, a lot of people, well, their first reaction is, we want to charge sales tax on gas, which, we can argue the policy of whether or not that would be good to do. But the problem with Pennsylvania not having sales tax on gas is it's a market distortion. If you are a business and you have a choice between buying a gasoline-powered vehicle or an electric-powered vehicle, if you buy the gasoline vehicle, you pay the motor fuels tax and no sales tax. If you buy the electric vehicle, there is an alternative fuels tax you should be paying, which works out to be the same as the motor fuels tax. But then if you're a business, you also pay sales tax on the electricity. So for business, if you go with a fossil fuel vehicle rather than an electric vehicle, you get a 6% discount essentially on your fuel, because Pennsylvania has chosen that we tax certain things and we don't tax other things. So we have these market distortions that people and our legislators in general are largely unaware of. One of the really odd ones in Pennsylvania is the property tax exemptions. I think most people would realize that, I think most people realize that almost anything that you would do to, improve your property that would increase the value of your property, certainly almost anything that you would do with your property that would make money is likely to alter your property tax assessment. Maybe not always, but it's likely to do that. So if you wanted to put a shed in the back of your yard and open up a pottery shop, that shed is going to increase the value of that land, and your tax assessment may be higher. If you put solar panels on your roof, that could increase the resale value of your home, and that could raise your property taxes potentially, not always, but in some cases it does. But just put on an extension because you want more room. That's going to raise your property tax. The groups that don't have this exposure to property tax in Pennsylvania are relatively small: government, churches, nonprofits in many cases, and schools. So really a fairly limited number. Except the gas industry gets this basically the same exemption that a church gets, the gas industry gets. If you put oil and gas wells on your property, that doesn't affect your property value. If you have just that they discover and they find oil and gas on your property, that doesn't affect your property value. It's just a weird quirk in Pennsylvania. It's not all fossil fuels. So if you had a coal mine on your land, yeah, your property value would go up. If you did solar or if you did wind, any of that can increase your property value. Gas doesn't. Gas has an exemption. It's just not part of the schools and municipalities are not authorized to look at gas when they're calculating property tax. Gross receipts tax, that's kind of an interesting one. In Pennsylvania, years and years ago, 20 some years ago now, we used to have regulated utilities, like your electric company. They own the power plant. They own, the power plant. They own the wires running across the state, the wires through your neighborhood. Everything from the power plant to the meter they own. And the gas industries work pretty much the same way too. They were these vertically integrated monopolies. About 20 years ago, we split things up. So the gas, so in your electric company, for example, your electric utility no longer owns any power plants. they buy power off the market, just, you know, really like anybody else does. And to the extent that they sell you power, it's really a pass-through transaction. Your utility is responsible for the local distribution network, not building power plants and selling you power. At the time we deregulated or we restructured, and we did it about the same time with the gas and the electric industry. We exempted the gas industry from the gross receipts tax. So gas utilities don't have to pay tax, the gross receipts tax. Electric utilities, which are pretty much in the same boat, do have to pay the gross receipts tax. So again, if you're in a situation where maybe you're building a new home and you have to decide, do I want electric heat or do I want gas heat? One of the factors is because the electric utility, you know, the electric companies are going to be paying more taxes than the gas companies. That's going to make electric marginally higher. And that's also means that money that the gas companies would be sending to the general fund and the treasury and could be invested in other things isn't. So, you know, gas companies get a break, they get more profitable. Electric companies don't. Just the way it's set up in Pennsylvania. Lack of a severance tax. This is a really huge one in Pennsylvania. We're the only major oil and gas producing state that doesn't have a severance tax. The companies try to say, oh yeah, but we have this thing called an impact fee, which is a very, very tiny tax. But the impact fee is really an attempt to, it's what's called a Pigovian tax. It's an attempt to pay for the damage that the industry is causing. It doesn't do 100% of it, but things like damage to roads and issues like that impact the local community, that's attempting to pay their own way, even slightly. A severance tax is, you know, states collect severance taxes because there are resources that are valuable for the state. And if we exploit all the resources immediately and leave nothing for later, that's not good for Pennsylvania, that's not good for any state. And severance taxes are a way to you know, compensate the state for this lost future value of their resources. And every other state collects them. We don't. And the other thing, yeah, another classic tax exemption is a thing called a Keystone Opportunity Zone. Now, so this isn't necessarily a bad thing. You know, you get an area, especially an area has economically disadvantaged, you can give businesses tax credits for locating in that area. But what we see is, you know, there's a lot of emphasis on saying, if we want economic development, the way that we do that is we encourage polluting industry to come in. And in that respect, this operates as a subsidy for fossil fuels. What we could do is focus on sustainable industries coming into these communities. Largely, we don't do that. So these are like straight out exemptions from taxes. Tax credits are another similar beast. Now the legislature, we've got some people in the legislature that say tax credits don't really count as subsidies. And the way they argue this is they say, for example, this first one is the PA Resource Manufacturing Tax Credit. This is over 25 years, it'll be about $1.65 billion, targeted specifically at Shell, at Royal Dutch Shell, for building a cracker facility in Western Pennsylvania. And they get other subsidies besides this, but this is a tax credit. Now, what the legislators will tell you is they will say, well, if we didn't give them this tax credit, they wouldn't come into Pennsylvania anyway. So there wouldn't be any money coming into the Pennsylvania economy. And the fact that we give them a tax credit is like free money. It doesn't count because we wouldn't have it anyway. You hear that argument a lot. And you hear that argument with a number of these tax credits. Now, the problem with that is you could invest in a lot of different industries and you could give a lot of industries a tax credit. The fact that you choose to give it only to fossil fuels, and to this case, only to Shell, is very specifically acts as a subsidy for that company. Maybe Amazon wants to build a warehouse, or somebody that doesn't, Tesla wants to build a factory, or some other company wants to come in here and do something that's not a fossil fuel industry. Well, we're already giving these, this tax break to fossil fuels. Also, fossil fuel use has direct negative impacts, and we'll talk some about a number of them later, on Pennsylvania, on the citizens and on the communities. And part of the idea with having taxes is trying to compensate Pennsylvania and compensate those communities and give Pennsylvania the funds it needs to try to mitigate some of the problems. If you're giving out these tax credits, you don't have that money coming in anymore. So it definitely acts as a negative and a drag on the economy. The local resource tax credit is a similar thing to this PA resource tax credit. We don't know what company is going to get it yet, but this is the Shell one was for an ethane cracker in Western Pennsylvania. The local resource manufacturing tax credit is for people similarly using dry gas, so fertilizer manufacturers, or businesses like that. And there's talk about North Central Pennsylvania locating some of these. And again, they would get many, many millions of dollars in tax credits that is only open to people that buy fossil fuels. So you could have the best business idea for Pennsylvania, most jobs, great for the economy, and all of this doesn't matter. If you don't buy fossil fuels, you don't get this tax credit. Another one, and we'll talk a lot more about this, is the coal refuse and energy reclamation tax credit. We'll talk about it in the waste coal when we talk about waste coal a bit later on. But again, this is one where the government says, if you burn this particular type of waste product, you get a tax credit. And all of these, these ones in particular, these are transferable tax credits, which in some cases, up until just recently, for example, the tax credits like the investment tax credit that you could get for solar panels, or the production tax credit, which a lot of wind farms took advantage of, those weren't transferable. So if you are a solar company, or if you're a wind company that doesn't actually have a lot of revenue, and you don't have that big tax burden to start with, having a tax credit doesn't help you, because you don't have the tax expense anyway. So what solar and wind companies largely had to do was enter into these transactions where a middleman would come in and siphon off the tax credit, and take some of the profit as part of the deal, but to allow the they would essentially have some basically somebody come in that really wasn't associated with a transaction, acting as a middleman, so they could get a tax credit. With the fossil fuel industry, that largely doesn't happen. They're transferable tax credits. So if you have a waste coal generator and you have more tax credit than you need personally, you can sell it and somebody else can get the tax credit. And this also kind of, you can see the lie in this. Well, this doesn't take any money out of the treasury. If it's a transferable tax credit and the company isn't actually fully utilizing the credit themselves, they can sell it to people that are paying taxes. So another one of these structures of the way they use tax credits for subsidies. And the picture here is the construction of the Shell cracker facility. There's a lot of other incentives, and we'll break some of these down in different ways, but they take a lot of different forms, and all of these are just selected examples. There are many, many more of each of credits and subsidies in each category. But for fossil fuels specifically, we have things like our alternative energy portfolio standards rule, which if you have, for example, if you have solar panels on your roof, for each megawatt of power you generate, you generate a It's called an SREC, or solar renewable energy credit. Sell that for right now about $25, $25. If you have a wind farm, each megawatt gets you about $5 or $6. We in Pennsylvania have another tier 2, that includes things like waste coal generation. And we'll talk more about that going on, but we essentially require 10% of the consumption of energy in Pennsylvania to come from these tier 2 sources, and waste coal is a big part of that. So we're essentially mandating that people buy a certain amount of waste coal power. Things like low-cost bonding is another way subsidies sneak in. If you have a oil and gas well, if you are lucky, repairing that or remediating that well after it's done production, so sealing it off so it doesn't leak and it's safe. If you're lucky, that would cost $30,000. It's probably on average much closer to $100,000, and when you're talking about like a Marcellus shale well, probably significantly higher than that. So tens, likely hundreds of thousands of dollars to plug a well. Now, we have hundreds of thousands of abandoned wells in Pennsylvania. We actually don't know how many we have for sure. We found a couple 100,000. We think there's more. We're pretty sure there's a lot more. Back 100 years ago, if people plugged a well at all, they would take a tree stump or a tree branch and jam it down the well. So it wasn't plugged. And this creates public health problems for Pennsylvania. I mean, we've seen, houses that have got methane in their water. We've seen families suffer from arsenic poisoning. Lots of things can happen from these. Well, in order to prevent this from happening going forward, typically what we do is require companies to bond so that there's money set aside that they will be able to clean up these after the fact. The problem is with oil and gas wells, we don't require them to set aside enough money to actually fix the problem. The bond is, there's relatively tiny bond, just a matter of a few $1,000s. In fact, if they pay a $25,000 blanket bond, which doesn't plug one well, they can cover all their wells with the one bond. So, what we have done is we, as the citizens of Pennsylvania, have now said, we're going to assume that risk for you. You can go ahead and you can operate. If you go bankrupt, if you fail, if you walk away from this, yeah, we'll keep the $25,000, but all the other costs to plug the well, we'll just take care of that for you. They're not financially, essentially not financially liable because their bonding is inefficient. This picture that you see here is of an event of mine subsidence, where houses were built under an old mine. The mine collapsed and it destroyed the house. That's not, in Pennsylvania, that's not the mine owner's responsibility. Mines are not held liable for this sort of damage. So what we have done to protect citizens is allow them, and through the DEP, to buy from the state mine subsidence insurance. So if you live in an area where there is a lot of mining, you could actually go and buy a low-cost insurance policy from the state. And the big question is, well, why aren't the industries that are doing the mining paying the damage? And they never have, and it's just not the rule in Pennsylvania. We provide that. We have programs like the Department of Community and Economic Development, even within the DEP, the Alternative Fuel Incentive Grants, actively going out, encouraging people to, buy gas via, essentially use fracked gas. So we've got companies in there that are encouraging people to buy gas. People may have heard a few years back about this VW settlement where Volkswagen was cheating on their emissions controls, and billions of dollars actually, were paid in settlement money, and some of it's coming to Pennsylvania, and it has to be used on things that reduce emissions. But it's not limited to things that are clean energy. It's not limited to electric vehicles. It's not limited to to things like that. you can take your diesel truck and burn fracked gas in it, and you can get the subsidy from the state. So we're actively encouraging people to buy fuel. In tax structures, and this goes federal and state, for fossil fuel companies, they can create certain business structures that have preferential tax treatment. And there's some, like in Pennsylvania, the master limited partnership business structure is set specifically. It works out. The gas companies can take advantage of it, and through this structure, they pay less taxes. And it's something where if you're a solar company or if you do some other clean energy thing, you don't get. So a really wide variety of different ways that Pennsylvania acts to incentivize fossil fuels. And this is just really a small portion of them. There's many more than that. But the big one that people never talk about is environmental externalities. This is the cover of the new sixth assessment report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where they have tied now more closely than ever the damage we are seeing from storms like the ones we just saw to climate change. The evidence, it was always suspected that there was a tie between those. The Earth is warming, oceans warm oceans, are what power hurricanes. We see more and more damaging hurricanes. Not a big leap, but the evidence is just building more and more. So, for climate in particular, we see a direct damage. We talk about the social cost of carbon. Now, there's a lot of debate under what the social cost of carbon is. Some people say $50 per ton. Some say 100, 120. I've seen even higher numbers than that. The EPA for a while was acting like it was $20 a ton. And whatever that value is you pick, this is money we are not collecting. Fossil fuel, we are subsidizing fossil fuels because they are creating this damage and leaving the rest of us to pay for it. Climate change is certainly probably the largest factor, but beyond that, there's a wide range of problems. If we talk about regular smog forming pollution like ozone, oxides of nitrogen, particulate matter, we see, and we have seen for decades now, that, for example, if you have a high ozone day, about 2 to 3 days after that high ozone day, hospital admissions for chronic respiratory issues spike. And it happens again and again, and it happens all over the world. So we pollute, the pollution results in a high ozone day, and we get this spike in hospital admissions. Now, it's easy to look at this strictly from the economic lens and forget the fact that that spike in hospital admissions is very real issues for the family, the pain and suffering that family goes through with illnesses and premature death. I mean, that's very real. But there's also clearly the economic impact as well. I mean, our health insurance costs are affected in part because the insurance companies, have to cover the cost of preventable illness and disease that results from air pollution. When a child can't go to school because of an asthma attack, they lose that education, and that setting the child behind, especially at the critical phases of development, that can really have an impact over their whole career, where they end up. Do they end up successful, or do they end up struggling forever? Really can be impacted by air pollution. Certainly lost productivity. Somebody can't go to work, or somebody has to take off work because of that child with asthma. That's going to have an economic impact on the business and the community as a whole. And then, certainly property damages. And this is probably the biggest thing we've seen with the recent storm damage that we saw. A lot of that can be traced directly to pollution. And the other one people don't get a lot is this idea of the opportunity cost. because we have given so much in the way of subsidies to fossil fuels, that's fewer resources we have to invest in the things that we need to be investing in to fix these problems. So, you know, not counting these externalities as subsidies is a big thing you will see in the fossil fuel industry. They will completely ignore them whenever they can. And I think all my quotes in here come from Republicans, so which is kind of odd for one of my talks. But former Governor John Sununu, who worked for George H.W. Bush, you know, he does hit the nail on the head. You know, when is it a loophole? You know, and when is it a subsidy for special interests? You know, a lot of it depends on your point of view, and obviously the companies that are arguing for these subsidies are saying, you know, we're going to be great for the, you know, we're going to bring jobs, we're going to do all these wonderful things, and that's how they're convincing the politicians to get them the subsidies. And we are not saying all subsidies are bad. You know, there's certainly, you know, a place for investing in the things that you need. You know, spend money on the stuff we want more of. So it's, you know, clean energy, it's sustainable jobs is where we should be putting resources, not giving money to, you know, already profitable industries. And just one example of that, and this is one that's kind of hit the news in current events in Pennsylvania, is how we deal with the waste coal problem. Now, waste coal, that picture in the lower right, I think people have probably, you know, seen over the years. These are the breaker boys in the coal regions where, you know, children, you know, really under 10 in many cases, would be working in these breakers, sorting out good, valuable coal from coal waste. And what those breaker boys did, you know, what that resulted in was all this waste coal, the stuff that was low energy value, they couldn't sell, they just threw it away. And in, you know, you go anywhere through the coal regions in Pennsylvania, you'll see this, you know, particularly if you go up, you know, up 81 or up through, you know, Allentown, Frackville, places like that. There's these piles all over the place. We have billions of tons of waste coal around Pennsylvania, and it is an environmental catastrophe. The stuff, it rains on it, it leaches out water into the land, into the streams. You know, we have orange streams all over the state from the drainage from this that are, you know, dead, devoid of all life. Occasionally they catch on fire. They're very hard to put out. So, you know, really a significant environmental problem. And the legislature, not surprisingly, doesn't want to appropriate the money to just go in and clean them up. I mean, it's a hard problem to fix. You'd have to remine it, and probably like the best you could do is find a lined, appropriately permitted landfill and put it in the landfill. So at least it's not leaching anymore, and, you know, cover it over and, you know, be done with that. It's probably the best you could do with this stuff. You know, in some cases you can plant grasses over it and stabilize it so it's not leaching anymore, but that costs money, and the legislature hasn't done that. So what happened instead was the waste coal industry came and said, you know, this is low value coal. It's not valuable as a fuel source or somebody would already be burning it. But if you heavily subsidize us, we'll burn it and that'll get rid of it. And that does, you know, in some cases get rid of it from polluting the land and the water. But then it pollutes the air. So you get, you know, CO2, mercury, you know, heavy metals, acid gases, ozone precursors, air toxics, carcinogens, all of this stuff comes out of this waste coal and goes into the air. Now, from the point of view of a legislator, they and their constituents can see the pile, but they and their constituents largely can't see the air pollution. We've gotten good enough at managing air pollution that it's largely invisible. And when, you know, elementary school student in the next town over gets asthma, people go, oh, that's sad, they got asthma, not they got asthma because there was air pollution caused by this facility. Nobody makes that connection. But so this is the status quo. We have 12 of these facilities now operating in Pennsylvania that are burning the waste coal. And they were largely built. They have a stack of subsidies. They were largely built under this thing called PURPA, where they were essentially had long-term contracts to sell their fuel at above market rates, sell their energy at above market rates to utilities. So they were built at a time where to get a loan from a bank to build the facility, it was easy because they were guaranteed to sell power for 20 or 30 years, even if it cost more. So a lot of them got built. They get capacity payments from our grid. They just for being there, available to generate power, they get this capacity payment. Now, capacity programs aren't a bad thing by themselves, but waste coal facilities take advantage of this. We talked about the tier two alternative energy credits that they get, where about 10% of our generation, our consumption has to come from these sources. So they get bonus payments for that. We talked earlier on about the coal refuse tax credit, where they get paid $4 a ton in tax credits just for burning this stuff. They also, under our new rule that's working its way through, where Pennsylvania will join the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative, waste coal facilities get the credits for free. They're pretty much exempt from that. And particularly under Trump's EPA, they were pretty much exempt from the mercury and air toxic standards and other rules like that. They're largely exempt from a lot of pollution standards. A waste coal facility is dirtier than a conventional coal facility, which is already pretty dirty. They don't have to meet these high standards. So we have this, the companies are saying, well, we're cleaning up these waste coal piles, and legislators see that and they think it's good, so they give them these stacks and stacks of subsidies. Now, this may be backfiring, and this is kind of like a real-time current event, where what we're seeing is, because of these subsidies, now these Bitcoin mining companies are coming and locating at waste coal facilities. They already own Scrubgrass, one of the facilities. They're buying Panther Creek. They're buying a third. This one company in particular is buying a third one, where they want to put in 57,000 of these mining boxes to generate Bitcoins. One of these boxes uses about 3 times as much energy a day as the average Pennsylvania household. So 57,000 of them are pretty significant. And what they're claiming, these companies, they gravitate to whatever the cheapest energy source is. And normally that wouldn't be waste coal, but Pennsylvania is subsidizing waste coal. So now they're saying, because of all these subsidies that we're giving to these companies, this is now, in their view, the cheapest energy available. So they're locating in, and they're going to, try and burn as much of it as they can. They're saying that they can create a Bitcoin for $3,000 using heavily subsidized power, when I checked today, and a Bitcoin is worth $47,000. So enormous profits. And they're only doing this, in Pennsylvania, because of the level of subsidies. Now, Bitcoin isn't just a waste coal problem. In New York State, they're burning gas for this. This Susquehanna Station nuclear power plant is now in part is being used for this. Highly, highly wasteful when it comes to energy. I can talk more about that, but what's happened, it's largely, they're largely doing this with waste coal because of the subsidies. This is from a form that's one company, Stronghold Digital Mining, filed this summer with the Security and Exchange Commission. And what it's saying there is basically we've given them up to $45 million a year in subsidies. That just adds to their profit. They'd be profitable without it, without any of these subsidies. But that's how much we're just adding to their profit margin. We're basically paying 60% of their energy costs. And one of the biggest ones is this thing, RECs. That's that tier 2 alternative energy credit that where we have to buy 10% of our power from these sources. It used to be that a REC, like in 2019, a tier 2 REC was worth about 37 cents. Well, at the end of 2020, our legislature changed the rules. So these RECs, rather than coming from anywhere in a 13-state region that encompasses our power grid, have to come from Pennsylvania. And because they closed the borders on this, it's driving up the REC prices for tier 2. And now they are actually trading at $15, $16 or more. I'm hearing about trades going much higher than that, but or more for one of these RECs, which means burning waste coal from this REC program is more valuable to these companies than, they get more for burning waste coal than wind companies get for generating wind power, significantly more. They're getting, in some cases, probably rivaling solar in what they're getting for these REC values.
Rob, I hate to interrupt you, but we really have to wrap it up fairly soon.
Last slide. Yep. And this is what, basically this is what we're saying in our report. We should know what we're paying for. These subsidies have been on the books for ages. We should pay attention to what we're paying for, add them up, and know what we're getting. We should realize that they used to say pollution is progress. That doesn't have to be the case anymore. You can increase economic growth and lower emissions. Politicians don't believe it and they don't act like it's the case, but it is. Polluter pays principle. The costs of environmental damage should be borne by the polluter. Yes, they're going to pass it on to consumers, but then consumers can make a choice. When it's subsidized, we don't have the information to make the choice. And in general, stop subsidizing pollution, invest in people, invest in communities, invest in sustainability. And that's the succinct result of our report.
Okay,
and I'll stop there.
There were a couple of questions in the chat. Joyce had 2 questions and Rick had a question.
Okay, Rick, isn't Bitcoin digital? What do they need to build? To generate a Bitcoin, you have to do a calculation. And it's basically the chance of mining a Bitcoin is orders of magnitude lower than the chance of winning the lottery. So you have to do this calculation. It's called running a hash. And basically you have to try trillions and hundreds of trillions, millions of trillions of times before you're likely to get one. And what these miners do are they're supercomputers basically that run hashes to up their odds of actually mining a Bitcoin. And I can talk offline about it in a lot more detail. The pipelines, pipelines, they've got their own different types of subsidies. Part of it is a lot of whether a pipeline gets built or not is based on a statement of need, where they try to justify and say, yes, we're going to build this because we need it. And whether or not we need it, whether we need this for an economic purpose or we need this for this business to be profitable, it's not clear. I mean, it's not always, we don't always need it when they say we do.
Rob?
By the government. Yeah.
Okay, this is Joyce. I'm just so aware of the pipeline that's trying to run through Delaware County that the way I see it is that the company wants to get its oil produced from one place, point A to point B. And they see this as a safe alternative to, I guess, trucking it or whatever. The problem is that it starts out in an unpopulated area. And before it's done, it's traveling through the most heavily populated areas in our state. And I mean, it's only been stalled because people have gone to court to stop it. So like there has to be something, there has to be some way for the ordinary citizen. And that goes back to my first question about property taxes. There has to be some way for the citizens of Pennsylvania to make their voices heard, to stop what's happening for these fossil fuel businesses. Yes.
Well, for the property tax exemptions particularly, it's the legislature will have to pass a rule to change it. And they could, they just haven't yet. And, you know, so that it's going to take legislative action. You know, for that particular issue, it's more of a Pennsylvania state legislature issue. But, you know, even on the federal side, there are things that the government does to speed the building and incentivize the development of things like pipelines. They create the regulations in a way that makes it easier for pipelines to get built. You know, these massive pipelines, it's not one big permit for the massive pipeline, it's lots and lots of little permits. And that happens to benefit the company, because when you do the environmental, you know, in an environmental assessment, you're not putting a pipeline across the entire Pennsylvania. You're only looking at one slice and saying, well, this piece doesn't necessarily, you know, do that much damage, and that piece doesn't do that much damage. And that's, you know, that's the structure that we have. I'm trying to see what questions I have. Yeah, pipelines are tricky. There's a lot of other ways that, you know, that the government maybe is complicit. You know, pipeline safety in a lot of respects is the responsibility of, you know, to some respects, it's the Public Utility Commission, and in some respects, it's other organizations. So it's not clear that we really do have effective oversight over, you know, and you know, ensuring public safety on these. You talk about going through populated areas. On some of these pipelines, because when gas is being used for plastics and things like that, they don't inject the mercaptan in it, the scent that natural gas smell that you know if you leave the gas on in the kitchen. That scent isn't what gas smells like. That's injected into the system so we can detect gas leaks. But they don't put it in the gas that's going on these pipelines in many cases. So if one goes through your property and it's leaking, you might not know.
Right.
Because it's odorless, tasteless, colorless. You know, unless it's a really, you know, obviously if it blows up or if there's a really bad leak, you would.
Where does the EPA fit into all this?
I mean, they are, depending on the pipeline, they are involved in the permitting process. You saw that with, well, you know, really, you know, like all of the major pipeline projects, and the EPA and DEP, in many cases, they're regulatory agencies, and we think Environmental Protection Agency, Department of Environmental Protection, their main job is protect the environment, which, well, yeah, that's their job, but what they are allowed to do is only whatever the legislature lets them do.
Okay.
So there are many cases where you could look at, you know, a pipeline and say there's an environmental problem there, or you know, in the state or the federal government, and the DEP might be like, yeah, if somebody comes in with a permit to DEP, the DEP cannot reject the permit because they think it's a bad idea. They you know, they don't have the authority to do that. They have to say, well, did you meet these standards and did you meet those standards? And if they can check the boxes, the company's entitled to the permit. Yeah, we don't get to reject them for, and just being risky isn't enough in many cases. And that's,
Thank you.
again, the way the legislature's done it. has
Thank
things
you.
up.
Thank you, Rob. That was really a lot of information. I took a lot of notes. I think the bottom line really is that people don't even understand what the subsidies are. And I loved your quotes. I mean, they're just such great quotes for us to be feeding back to our legislatures. So within the next week or so, in Washington, D.C., they're going to be voting on the budget reconciliation plan. And it's really important for us to call our legislators, particularly your representatives and Casey, but particularly your representative if they have not come out in favor of these benefits, taking away the tax breaks. So I have posted a couple of times how you can find your legislatures and call them. You can call them at any hour of the day and night and tell them what you think about this. You can tell them about what we learned tonight about the tax breaks for the fossil fuels and how there are so many things, or you can talk about other things that are really on your mind. It might be giving money to the impoverished communities to be able to be doing things. It could be money for investments. So make a commitment to making a phone call in the next week or so, or even many phone calls in the next week or so. Phone calls are really easy. You can write a script of one sentence, call the representative and just say your name, and this is a voicemail that you're leaving, your name, where you live, with your zip code. You don't have to give your address, just your town, and tell them what you think, then why this is so important for them to put this into the budget plan. I call numerous times a day. You can call the district office, you can call the Washington office. So I'll be happy to answer questions about calling.
I was going to say, Phyllis, if I could add to that point, I've done a fair bit of lobbying where I go in and talk to legislators. Do not be afraid that you do not know like all there is to know about the topic or can't get into depth on it. Just saying you're concerned about a topic without getting into any details is a good start, because what's great when you have people that come in as lobbyists that work on the issues like myself and other people at PennFuture. If we go into a legislator's office and they say, I just got off the phone with a constituent, or we just heard from a constituent that's concerned about this, will you tell me about it? That's a whole lot better than coming in with and trying to convince a legislator to care something that nobody's ever called him about.
Thank you. So it's very easy. Write a one-sentence script, make a phone call to your representative, make a phone call to Senator Casey. It's probably not super important for you to call Senator Toomey, because right now the budget reconciliation plan is only going to be with the Democrats in both the House and in the Senate. And normally we encourage people to write letters, but I think right now it's more important to call, and to call repeatedly. If you want to write a letter, that would be fabulous. I put up in the chat also the template for writing letters, and then you can easily personalize them. Because the deadline for writing letters is a little bit later than the vote might take place, we're suggesting that you send the letter as on the comment page on their site, their website, and also then send it to me, and then we'll be bundling those letters. So it is now 8 o'clock, and I recognize that some people might be wanting to get back to other things in their life on a Sunday night. So I'd be happy to entertain questions. Probably Rob would also. But thank you so much for coming. But I can't emphasize enough, make a phone call. Thank you, Rob. Thank you, Joyce, for enlightening us and for giving us inspiration and lots of food for thought. Any questions?
Phyllis, are you going to send out just a little follow-up that might have that find your representative?
Sure, I'll do that.
That would be great. Thank you so much.
You might
And
want to
if
wake
you-
up Peter Winslow. Oh, there's a smile.
He was taking every word in, just had his eyes closed.
Ah,
You'll also find it at the bottom of the message that I sent out along with the call that says, here's the sample letter, but it's at the very, very bottom of the sample letter. It says, find your members of Congress. Are you in Scanlon's district, Joyce?
My what? Am I what?
Are you in Scanlon's district?
Yes,
I
Mary
thought
Gay.
so. Yeah.
And there's a Jennifer O'Mara, and I'm not quite sure. I think she's a Pennsylvania representative. And Mary Gay Scanlon's in the Congress.
Right. So we're talking about federal voting this week.
Okay,
It gets confusing because these issues are so
Yes.
overlapping. Right now, we're talking about the federal voting. The state has not yet. The Reggie is the big issue within the state, but we're not pushing for the state right now.
okay, great. Thank
Great.
you.
Thank
Well,
you.
that's good. Then I know who I'm calling.
Yeah, you're calling Scanlon.
Yeah, she's good.
Yeah, she is good, but even if they're good, they need to hear that their constituents really care about this.
Okay, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Wanna
Any
say
other
good night?
questions? Good night. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay, thank you all. You can pick up the telephone and make a call right now. The recording machine takes place any time of the day or night, so you don't even have to encounter an individual. And have an excellent week as we enjoy this nice fall weather.